Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I have a very interesting ghost story here. It's actually kind of two ghost stories in one. It comes from an issue of Light magazine. It was published in 1881. Light was geared toward people who believed in spiritualism, but they also tossed in other things, such as ghost stories. And this is an article written by an author identified only by initials, JC, and the title is What I Know About Ghosts. My father, one of a long line of farmers, lived at Drayton in Berkshire. His place was called Manor House Farm, rented from one of the Oxford colleges. When he moved into it, it had long been unoccupied because, so people said, the old manor house was haunted. My father did not mind that, for my grandfather tenanted a haunted house. He even thought a ghost might put something worthwhile in his way. Manor House was of a good size and old. In it was an oak-paneled room with a fireplace as wide as a small gateway. This room was especially said to be haunted. I remember one Sunday autumn evening, all of the family, my father, mother, brother, two sisters, and myself, with our sweethearts, were in this room, some on one side of the fireplace and some on the other. Before candles were lighted, the red embers of a large wood fire glowing on the hearth, all of us perceived a tall figure in an old-fashioned military dress walking to and fro from the end of the room in our direction, with hands folded behind and chin sunk on the breast. He did not seem to heed us, but at every turn came nearer to the fireplace, enabling us all to have a full view of him, and at last was lost to our sight at the fireplace. This ghostly figure had been seen before, but never so clearly, nor by so many at once. He always seemed self-absorbed, and his appearance never led to anything. The lady, now my wife, who was one of those present then, was on a visit once to my sisters. One evening she went, candle in hand, to the larder for something for the supper table. As she descended some steps leading to it, she seemed to lose her hold of the candlestick, and it went to the ground. She felt for the dish she went for and brought it away. Next night she went again. This time she was careful to hold the candlestick firmly, but at the very same spot she felt it forcibly drawn from her hold and thrown into a corner. When visitors came, my brother and I had sometimes to sleep in a bed made up in the oak room. We were not surprised if the clothes were stripped off the bed or at being sometimes jerked off the bedstead. Our curate used to drop in when passing, and I told him once of our experiences in this way, and I said the ghosts of the old house did it. He drew himself up and asked if anything was on my mind, and said it was his duty to call on me to confess anything troubling my conscience, for as to ghosts there were none. I said I was thankful that my mind was easy, but that the things happened of which I told him, and he would perhaps know them himself if he slept there. He said he would, so that he might speak to me with more authority and put an end to such talk. So one evening the bed was made up in the oak room for him. Before we wished him good night, I showed him the door of my room that he might call on me if he wanted anything. In the night there was a hasty rattling at my door, and in rushed the curate, asking me to let him lie by my side until morning. I wanted him to tell me what was the matter, and asked if anything was on his mind. I could get nothing out of him, but he did not preach to me again about a troubled conscience. When my father took the house, he had in memory, as he used to tell us, the experience of my grandfather many years before. In relating this experience, I must draw upon my recollection, quite vivid, of conversations of father and mother. My grandfather farmed at West Drayton. The farmhouse and farm next adjacent had long stood untenanted. The house was said to be haunted. Grandfather did not believe in ghosts. He made a good bargain with the landlord and added the farm to his own. The house he would occupy or let to his laborers. Grandmother believed what the people about said, that the haunting was by an old miserly farmer who I will call simply G. She believed all about the sights and sounds and stone throwings at the house. She said grandfather might take the fields, but she would have naught to do with such a house. Grandfather thought the ghosts were poachers and vagabonds, and he would know how to deal with them. Part of grandfather's bargain was that he should keep whatever he might find, as old G, who lived there so long, was reported to have hid money. The landlord said he had heard so and had had the house searched, and grandfather was welcome to keep his findings, if any. Getting possession, he had the rooms warmed and aired, then a bed put up for him to sleep in so that he could be ready for the laborers in the morning. The first night of his sleeping there, he was wakened by a movement of the bedstead. Rubbing his eyes, he perceived a figure with hands on the bottom bedposts. He thought it was one of the vagabonds come to frighten him. Grasping his pick, which he had placed at the bedside, he strode forward and struck at the figure as it moved toward the door. The pick passed through it into the floor. The figure beckoned to be followed and went down the passage. Grandfather rubbed his eyes, thought he must have been dreaming, and turned into bed again. In the morning his men came, and he went to work in hand with them. Next night he slept there again, and was again wakened by the bed shaking. Again the same figure with hands on the bedposts. Again he slipped out of bed and grasped his pick. The figure backed towards the door, beckoning. Grandfather said it was of no use hitting and motioned that he would follow. The figure glided into a little kitchen and there went down, the last to be seen of it being the eyes and beckoning hand. Grandfather, to know if this also were a dream, dropped his pick where the eyes and hand disappeared and turned back to bed and to sleep. In the morning the pick was not at his side. Following his footsteps of the night before, he saw it, as he had dropped it, in the corner of the little kitchen. "Then I was not dreaming," he said to himself, "and I'll see where you went." With pick, shovel, and labor, he unearthed sundry crocks containing coin, and then a carefully packed piece of blanket containing more. My father used to say that, judging by circumstances, there must have been a good sum total. Grandfather never said how much. When the landlord heard the rumor that money had been found, he put in a claim, but acting under advice, grandfather told the landlord to keep to his bargain, kept quiet himself, and the landlord ceased troubling him. It was remarked that the house was unhaunted after the unearthing of the coin. It would look as though the barrier of it had had to get that part of his earthly work undone. In seeking to do this, he had frightened those whom he had been able to approach until my cool, robust grandfather came in his way. A reflection occurs to me. Was the spirit in the manor oak room drawn thither by the memory of a wrong with which that room and that fireplace were associated? Perhaps so, and perhaps it was a wrong not to be rectified by the restitution to orderly use of any earthly thing. And that apparently is what JC knows about ghosts. And it's interesting because it presents two different kinds of ghosts. The grandfather story is a very, very old one, and the kind of ghost presented in it is very, very old, going back to the earliest records of ghostly phenomenon. It's a purposeful ghost, or a ghost with unfinished business. It comes back to Earth because it needs to accomplish some goal, whether it's to tell people where the money is buried, or to pay off debts, or sometimes it's a murder victim who wants to expose who the murderer is and where the body is laying. That's, as I say, a centuries-old kind of ghost, a purposeful ghost. But in the 1800s, either ghosts changed or the records of ghosts changed, which is probably much more likely. Ghosts just sort of randomly appear. They don't seem to have any business to complete. They just do weird stuff. It's kind of like the grandson's ghost. He's just there. There's a theory on this kind of ghost. Well, there are many theories on ghosts, but one of them is residual energy. And there's a traumatic event, often a murder, and that event just sort of echoes over and over and over. And you can try to interact with those ghosts, but there's no consciousness there. It just loops. It just repeats and repeats and repeats. This next story is another haunted house story, but I'm not sure what kind of ghost we're dealing with here, if it's purposeful or purposeless, or something much darker. Now, there's kind of a slow burn on this one, so stick with it. We get to a pretty climactic climax. That's redundant, I know. It was published in Ainsworth Magazine in 1846 in an article titled Immaterialities, or Can Such Things Be? And it's written by Charles Hooton. I seriously stake my own credit upon the accuracy of the circumstances to be now related, and leave my audience to make of them anything or nothing at your pleasure. In the year 1829, I was sent from the country to London for the purposes of study at the celebrated establishment for drawing in Charlotte Street, Bloomsbury. My lodgings were on Caroline Street, Bedford Square, and consisted of a parlor and a sleeping room on the third story. That story was divided into 3 rooms, the middle one being mine, one occupied by the maid, and the third by the man and his wife, they had no family, who tenanted the house. The second story, or first floor as it is usually termed, was wholly occupied by an old lady almost bedridden, or at least so much of an invalid as to be always confined to her room, and the female servant who slept in her mistress's chamber at night. Thus, 6 persons, myself included, were the sole residents of the house. I am thus particular on these points for reasons which will soon become obvious. Our hours for study at the drawing school were from 7 till 5 daily. I was at that time almost totally without acquaintance to tempt me abroad after the day's application. Besides, I did not possess any taste for the ordinary public amusements of the metropolis. Nearly all my evenings were spent in either writing or reading, or perhaps a combination of both. In those days my efforts were totally without plan or method with respect to the division of time. When weary or disinclined for exertion, I retired to rest as early as 9 o'clock. Otherwise, I sat up with pen or book till 1 or 2, perhaps later, but often varying at all hours between these extremes. Our inmates were, as may be easily supposed, very regular and quiet. We were scarcely ever put out of the ordinary routine by company. The house was generally silent by 11 o'clock, and I alone seemed by special license to exercise the right of going to bed when I pleased. 2 or 3 months, I think, passed away in this staid and regular manner. One night, however, after I had entered my chamber and closed the door, the sound of leisurely and by no means light footsteps along the passage arrested my attention. The sounds apparently originated from the servant maid's room door and moved to that of the apartment occupied by my landlord and his wife. The circumstance struck me as singular, as I knew they had all retired to rest some time before. I listened, but heard nothing more. Neither was one door opened or the other closed. It then, for the first time, pointedly came to my recollection that frequently on previous occasions had the same phenomenon occurred, and always in the same manner, without other disturbance, more or less. But up to the night specified it had not attracted my special notice. However, without the remotest feeling of alarm, or for a moment entertaining the idea that it proceeded from any but the commonest causes, I put out my light and slept soundly till morning. On the following night, without thinking previously in particular of the matter, I happened to retire to my room whilst the tenant of the house and his wife were at supper, and the servant was occupied in her necessary attendance upon them. As I passed the drawing-room occupied by the old invalid lady, I could overhear her conversing with her maid, and therefore knew there could be no one upstairs except myself. The hour was not yet 10, but the moment my room door was closed, the same heavy sounds of footfalls along the passage and from and to the same points as before were as distinctly and locally heard as though a booted dragoon had strode across. It must be confessed my surprise was great, but a second time I was content with listening, though to no better purpose than before. In vain it was to attempt to persuade myself that my sense of hearing had been deceived and that the sound was produced in some adjoining house. With as much apparent reason, I might have tried to argue myself into the belief that a person close at my elbow was really 20 yards off. Still, I felt no ways agitated or thrown off my ordinary equanimity of mind. The circumstance simply appeared, just then, unaccountable. That was all. Subsequent reflection, however, caused me to determine upon a short series of experiments, if such they could be denominated, for the purpose of satisfying myself respecting this mysterious nightly visitation, and these I resolved to try before resorting to the simple expedient of lying in readiness, throwing open the door, and obtaining ocular demonstration in case such was to be had. Accordingly, during several succeeding nights, I purposely went to bed at all hours, from 9 in the evening until 3 in the morning, when all in the house were up, and when all were in bed and asleep, when I could hear the inmates conversing in their respective rooms below, and equally well hear by their stentorious breathing that all were fast asleep. But the same result invariably followed. The ghostly footsteps came shortly after I had entered my room with the consistency and fidelity of those of a lover or of time itself. Satisfied so far on this point, and never, be it observed, having made by either word or action the most remote allusion to the subject before any person upon the premises, I became very uneasy. I finally determined on the ensuing night not to take off my clothes, but to close my door as usual and stand behind it, ready to rush out the moment I should hear the first footstep. On that eventful occasion, I purposely remained in my room below stairs until perhaps a couple of hours after all else in the house had retired and had time enough to become wrapped in profound repose. Then, taking off my slippers, I stole silently upstairs, listened cautiously on the first-floor landing, until assured that the old lady, whom I had never seen during the whole period of my occupancy, and her servant were asleep, I again proceeded upwards onto my own floor. There again I stood still and listened. In the dead silence of the hour, I could hear with almost painful distinctness the heavy and dream-disturbed respirations of 2 sleepers on one side of my own room and of the one on the other. The doors of both rooms were fast closed, and as my eye carefully glanced over the passage, I became fully assured that nothing mortal was awake and stirring within the walls of that house except myself. I softly glided into my chamber, closed the door without noise, set down my candle, and with the handle of the latch in my hand, awaited the expected and accustomed footsteps. They did not come. The circumstance surprised me more than all the rest. It seemed as though my purpose, though confined within my own soul, was known as well to the strange cause of these late vigils as to my own bosom. I waited and waited without effect, until tired of waiting any longer. I then, in perfect silence, sat down and began to peruse a book. Still, no sound broke upon the stillness of the night, and after a long reading, I laid the volume aside, satisfied that, for that night at least, I was in vain to watch any longer. Still reluctant to give up, considerable delay occurred before I put off my clothes and got quietly into bed. The instant I had done so, tramp, tramp, came the heavy feet by my door as firmly and solemnly as ever before. The room door was hard by the bed's head, and 2 or 3 moments at the utmost found me in the passage. There was nothing to be seen. The interrupted sound was not repeated, nor did anything exist to give the least intimation of the possibility of any person having made good his retreat on being surprised. Assuredly, the rooms on either side of me had not been opened. My eyes reverted to the staircase, when there broke upon my ear, apparently from the bottom of the first flight, the most horrible and truly hideous peal of mingled laughter and shrieking that human imagination can conceive. Its expression was that of bitter derision and hate or malice, but that it was a human sound nobody would, I am sure, for a moment have conceived. Under all the circumstances of the case, my blood ran chilly in my veins. Satisfied, though not enlightened, I returned to my chamber. Some 3 hours afterward, the dawn broke. I rose at my usual hour, but could not observe anything that in the slightest degree might lead me to believe that, excepting myself, there was a creature under the roof who knew anything whatever of the matter. Suspicion could not attach to either the sick old lady or her servant. Both were much too occupied, one with her diseases and the other with constantly recurring attentions, to meddle with such kinds of midnight amusements. With any other person in the house, the thing was impossible. Inquiries, calculated not to excite any suspicion, were made throughout the house. So far was any other individual from being aware of anything of the kind that considerable consternation was excited in consequence, which could not be readily allayed. However, I stoutly refused to explain what had caused my disturbance, and relocated to new lodgings the same day. This, however, was not quite the last I heard of it. Some 6 or 7 years afterward, circumstances brought me in connection with certain literary parties in the metropolis, and over a social dinner one evening, the subject of strange appearances was broached and discoursed upon. The above circumstances were narrated in much the same way as my listeners have heard them now. I was, much to my astonishment, informed by a well-known individual present that he had heard a similar story before from precisely the same locality. If, then, seeing is believing, surely we cannot be far wrong in predicating as much of hearing also. I don't know quite what to do with this story. Certainly in terms of is it a purposeful or purposeless ghost, I don't think that really applies. It's more just a ghost that seems to be messing with this guy's head. And, I'm tempted to think that it's something within the narrator and he's projecting these footsteps outside somehow. But then you get this final paragraph where it turns out that this has happened before, so that doesn't really hold up. And I don't think it would have made it into a magazine if not for that laughter and screech. That really seems to be what makes the story a scary one. If you're into this kind of thing, these ghost stories published during the Victorian period and purportedly true, I invite you to visit a website. The URL is ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. Ghostly Hearthside, treat that all as one word. You can also learn about the long, long history of what Shakespeare would have called winter's tales. But around, actually prior to the Victorian period, prior to Charles Dickens, it became associated with Christmas specifically. The long, long tradition of sitting around a fire and telling scary stories. Once again, you can find that website at ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. I'm Tim Prossel. Thank you very much for listening.